On August 21, 1996, in Moline, Illinois, an 11-year-old girl stepped out of her house and disappeared forever. No cries for help, no trace. Only a gray car remained, and a silence that would last nearly 30 years. Trudy Leanne Appleby was never found. What happened that summer afternoon? And why did the truth have to wait almost a lifetime to begin to emerge? Stay until the end of this video. Because this is not just a case. This is a story about time, about silence, and about a child who never came home. 28 years, 11 months, 23 days. These are not numbers to be read and forgotten. They are the time spent living and waiting, measured in the heavy breaths of people who never had the chance to say goodbye. 10,584 days had passed since that summer afternoon. To the outside world, it was enough time for memories to fade, for old stories to slip quietly into the past. But for Trudy Appleby's family, time never truly moved forward. It stopped, frozen in the moment when a child stepped out of her home and never returned. Some pains do not arrive with crying. They are not loud. They do not explode. They exist in quiet waiting. Waiting for a call in the dead of night. Waiting for a small clue. Waiting for an answer that year after year never comes. Trudy's family lived in this state for nearly 3 decades, suspended between fragile hope and a fear too heavy to name. Each morning was a reminder to keep living. Not because they were ready, but because there was no other choice. Each night was a return to the familiar void. An empty chair at the dinner table. A room without footsteps. A name no longer called naturally. Small things, but accumulated over the years, they became a burden too heavy for words. In 1996, Moline was a quiet town. Familiar streets. Neighborhoods where people believed children were safe. Where adults trusted that as long as they were home before dark, everything was fine. No one imagined that an ordinary afternoon could mark the line between before and after. No one imagined that silence could stretch for decades, becoming a haunting shared by an entire community. After that day, time brought no answers, only more empty years. Anniversaries passed quietly. Summers came and went. Children the same age as Trudy grew up, married, had kids of their own. But Trudy remained forever 11, in the family's memories, in old photographs, in stories told with a choked voice. Her family learned to live with a loss that had no endpoint. No ending to close the chapter. No farewell to soften the grief. Only the familiar question repeating through long nights, when all sounds had faded, and only silence remained. Where is she? At times, they thought they had grown accustomed to that silence. But the pain never vanished. It only sank deeper, waiting for a moment of weakness to rise again. In a fleeting dream. In a passing news story. In the image of a child walking by on the street, looking remarkably like the Trudy of long ago. For the community, this was a case. A file that grew thicker with each passing year. A name repeated whenever someone asked about unsolved stories. But for the family, it was the life of their child. A life cut short, leaving a void nothing could ever fill, no matter how much time passed. 28 years, 11 months, 23 days. Time long enough for a generation to grow up and grow old. Long enough for many to believe everything would be forgotten. But never long enough for the pain to become past for those left behind. It remained present in every ordinary moment, in every unanswered day. And then, when many believed this story would sink forever into silence, time stopped once more. Not because the pain vanished, but because after more than 10,000 days of waiting, someone finally had the courage to speak the words Trudy's family had waited nearly a lifetime to hear. We never gave up. Before becoming a name associated with pain and nearly 3 decades of waiting, Trudy Leanne Appleby was simply an 11-year-old child. Not a symbol. Not a case file. Just a girl living in a normal family, in a quiet town called Moline, a place where summer afternoons passed slowly, and children grew up in the sense of safety that adults took for granted. At 11, Trudy's world was still small. It was contained within the house where she grew up, her school, a few close friends, and those summer afternoons that seemed to stretch on forever. Trudy was like so many other children. She had simple, ordinary desires to go outside and play, to see her friends, to enjoy a summer afternoon without thinking about anything beyond tomorrow. Trudy's family was not special in any way. And that is what makes this story even more heartbreaking. The tragedy did not happen to some stranger, it happened to a completely ordinary child, in a setting that seemed safe, where no one imagined danger could appear right outside their doorstep. Moline in the 1990s was a town where adults knew one another, where neighbors greeted each other daily, where children could run outside without too much caution. In that environment, Trudy grew up believing the world around her was trustworthy. She had no reason to fear, nor had she been taught that there were dangers adults sometimes could not see. August 21, 1996, began like any other summer day. No warning signs. No uneasy premonitions. Trudy wanted to go swimming with a friend, a very childlike, ordinary wish. She asked her father, with the innocence of a child who believes the world always has room for simple joys like that. The answer was no. Not out of suspicion. Not out of fear. Just a very ordinary decision made by a father in a normal family. No one could have known that this answer would become an enduring, haunting memory for those left behind. According to later investigation records, Trudy left the house despite being denied. Phone logs show she continued with her plan. At 11, children often believe that as long as they return home on time, everything will be fine. Perhaps Trudy believed the same. For her, it was just a summer afternoon, a brief window before dinner, carrying no thought of danger. When Trudy stepped out onto the front walkway, there was no panic, no cries for help, no sign that anything was about to happen. She was simply a child standing in front of her familiar home on an ordinary afternoon. No one watched her for long, no one was on alert, because no one imagined that this would be the last time they would see her. What makes Trudy's story so haunting isn't the unusual, it's the cruel normalcy of it all. No dramatic scene. No warning signs. Just a child, a very ordinary decision made by an adult, and a single moment that would forever change the course of many lives. Later, when people speak of Trudy, they will talk about the gray car, the unidentified man, the scattered clues, and the gaps in the investigation. But before all those details, Trudy was still an 11-year-old girl. A child with the simplest, purest desires to go swimming, to see a friend, to enjoy a summer afternoon just like any other child. Trudy's family would later remember every small detail of that afternoon, the words that seemed meaningless, the actions that seemed ordinary, the fleeting moments that, if time could turn back, they wish they had paid more attention to. But time does not turn back. It only leaves memories and the lingering ache that stretches across the years. Trudy's childhood did not end with a clear period. It stopped midway, like a story cut off before it could be fully told. And that is what left her family carrying unanswerable questions for years afterward. If that afternoon had been different, would everything have changed? If that day's answer had been different, would Trudy still be here? No one can answer those questions, yet they follow Trudy's family through every passing summer, through every quiet year. And from that afternoon, which seemed so ordinary, Trudy's story left childhood behind, embarking on a long journey filled with silence, loss, and a conclusion that has never truly come. August 21, 1996, began like so many other days in Moline. A quiet morning. Familiar streets. No sign that this day would become an indelible moment in the memory of an entire community. Trudy woke up to a perfectly ordinary day. An 11-year-old child, with no thought yet of anything beyond the coming afternoon. No one in the family looked at her and imagined it would be the last time. No one could have known that the smallest moments of that day would later become memories they would carry for the rest of their lives. The afternoon arrived with the familiar summer sun. The air carried the laziness that only a holiday can bring. Trudy left the house with the carefree demeanor of a child. No worry. No fear. She stood at the walkway she had crossed countless times before, a place no one imagined could suddenly hold danger. According to a neighbor, Trudy was seen stepping into a gray car, a detail that seemed small at the time, but would later become the most crucial piece of the entire story. The man inside the car was not clearly identified. There was no argument, no struggle, just a brief moment short enough for everything to slip into a different, irreversible direction. The car drove away, and Trudy was gone. No alarm sounded. No scene forced anyone onto the street. Everything happened quietly, so quietly that no one realized what had just occurred. That silence would later become the most haunting part of it all. A child had vanished in broad daylight, leaving almost no trace. At first, Trudy's family didn't think the worst. Children sometimes come home late. Children sometimes play longer than expected. But time passed, and Trudy did not return. Each minute stretched longer than the last. Anxiety gradually deepened into worry, and worry gave way to fear. The streets around the house were seen in a different light. Every passing car made the hearts of those left behind beat faster. The family began calling out Trudy's name. They searched in vain, clinging to the fragile hope that if they took just a few more steps, they would find her somewhere. As afternoon gave way to evening, the silence was no longer ordinary. It became a clear sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Trudy's family was forced to confront a possibility they had not dared to imagine. She had not simply come home late. The police were called. The first questions were asked dry, necessary, unavoidable. When was the last time anyone saw Trudy? Who was she with? What was she wearing? For her family, each question felt like a knife, forcing them to relive that final moment, again and again. Night fell. Trudy still did not return. The lights in the house stayed on. The door remained open. But the one they were waiting for never appeared. In those hours, time no longer flowed normally. It stretched, heavy and oppressive, as if each second carried a dark premonition. News of the disappearance spread through the Moline community. A child vanished in broad daylight, right in her own neighborhood, right in front of her home. The sense of safety people had taken for granted began to crack. Adults looked at their own children differently. Neighbors started wondering if they had missed something. Many later remembered the moment they first heard about Trudy, not because they knew her personally, but because the incident shattered the belief that terrible things only happened far away. Trudy had disappeared in their own town. Trudy's final moments were never captured on camera. There were no recordings, no sounds, only accounts, and the absence itself. It was that absence that made the story more painful than any horrific detail could have. No one knew what Trudy thought in those last minutes. No one knew if she was afraid, if she called out to anyone. These questions had no answers, and perhaps they would follow her family for the rest of their lives. From the moment Trudy stepped into the gray car, the lives of countless people veered onto a different path. Her family embarked on a search that would stretch for decades. The Moline community lost its sense of peace, and Trudy's story left childhood behind, becoming a wound that never fully healed. The day Trudy disappeared did not end when the sun went down. It stretched into the next day, and into the many years that followed. Because that final moment did not just take a child, it took the sense of security of an entire community, leaving a question that still echoes to this day. When Trudy didn't come home that evening, the initial worry arrived slowly. Her family still tried to believe it was just the ordinary delay of a child. Kids sometimes get caught up in play. Kids sometimes lose track of time. No one wanted to think further, because even imagining the worst was more than they could bear. But as each minute passed, the silence began to take on a different meaning. Dinner cooled on the table. The door remained open. The porch light stayed on, and Trudy still hadn't returned. In that moment, the family began to realize they were stepping into something none of them had ever prepared to face. They called her name over and over. At first loudly, then hoarsely, then in desperate, quiet murmurs. The familiar paths around the house were searched with panicked eyes. Every familiar corner suddenly felt strange. Every shadow held a fragile hope that Trudy was just somewhere, scared, waiting to be found. Neighbors began to join in. One person called another. Dinners were left unfinished. Personal plans were set aside. In that moment, Moline was no longer just a collection of houses. It became a community united in the search for a child. Flashlights swept across lawns, along paths, through every space Trudy might have passed. Footsteps followed in silence. No one spoke much, because everyone understood that voicing their fear could make it unbearable. The police arrived. The first procedures were carried out. Questions were asked, again and again. When was Trudy last seen? Who was she with? What was she wearing? The questions were necessary, but to the family, they felt like knives, forcing them to relive the last moments with their child over and over. Night fell, and the search did not stop. Patrol car lights reflected off the silent houses. Every small sound made people startle. No one dared to speak the worst thought aloud, but everyone thought it. The next morning, Moline woke under a heavy atmosphere. News of Trudy's disappearance spread quickly. Posters were printed. The face of an 11-year-old girl appeared on utility poles, shops, community boards. A small, innocent face staring out into the world, as if asking someone to recognize her. The community continued the search. People who had never met Trudy joined in. Because she was a child. And because everyone understood that if this could happen to Trudy, it could happen to any child. Trudy's family entered a state of constant waiting. Phones became inseparable from their hands. Each ring made their hearts tighten. Each car stopping in front of the house brought a fleeting glimmer of hope. But for the most part, there was only silence, long, exhausting, merciless silence. Tips were reported, leads gave hope. And then, all fell back into silence. Each time, the family had to learn to endure another disappointment. No one taught them how to live in this state. They only knew to continue, because stopping meant letting go. Days passed, then weeks. Exhaustion showed on the faces of the searchers. But no one wanted to be the first to utter the words "it's over." Because once the search ended, the greatest fear would become undeniable. Gradually, public attention began to fade. Search teams thinned, but for Trudy's family, the search never ended. It only shifted from the streets to their minds, into restless nights, into days passing without answers. From that moment on, their lives were divided into two parts before Trudy disappeared, and after, a lifetime tied to waiting, fragile hope, and an unnamed despair. And that search, though it changed form, continued day after day, in silence. After the first days of searching, full of hope and despair intertwined, a reality slowly emerged that no one wanted to admit. Trudy still had not been found, and the initial clues, already fragile, began to fade over time. The investigation continued, but each passing day felt heavier than the one before. The familiar questions were asked again and again. Locations were checked repeatedly. Testimonies were examined carefully, yet everything seemed to revolve around an unfillable void. No clear witnesses. No decisive evidence. No answers to make sense of it all. For Trudy's family, the waiting entered a new phase. There were no longer large search parties. No flashlights sweeping across the lawns. Instead came long days passing in silence, a silence more frightening than any sound, carrying the sense that the case was gradually being left behind by the world. The police continued their work. Investigators revisited the files. But time was not on their side. Each passing year blurred the memories of witnesses. Small details became hard to verify. People who had once been questioned were no longer certain about what they had seen or heard. And with time, hope of uncovering the truth grew ever more fragile. Trudy's case gradually acquired a cold, clinical label: cold case. A technical term, yet for the family, it was a wound. Behind those two words was not just a file closed, and put aside it was the feeling that their pain was no longer at the center of attention. Years passed. Life outside continued. Other children grew up. Other families carried on with ordinary routines. But for Trudy's family, time seemed frozen. Each year brought no closure, only more questions. Where was Trudy? What had truly happened that afternoon? Sometimes, the family received new information. A phone call, a belated account, a lead that seemed promising. Each time, hope flickered briefly, only to be extinguished again. This repetition ensured that the pain never healed. It was reopened, over and over again. For investigators, this was one of the most difficult cases, not because of a lack of effort, but because of a lack of anchor points. No body, no clear crime scene, no confirmed sequence of events. Everything was based on assumptions, on accounts, on fragments that never fully aligned. The Moline community also changed over time. The initial fear gradually subsided, but never fully disappeared. Trudy's case became a story whispered in conversation, a reminder that some things had happened but were never explained. For Trudy's family, cold case did not mean the end. It only meant they had to learn to live with uncertainty, with not knowing, with each day possibly being another without answers. They learned to continue living but never truly to move on. In the years that followed, the case files were opened and closed again. Theories were proposed and discarded. Names appeared and vanished. Each time, the family had to hear the story of their child again, as if the wound could never be allowed to heal. A cold case is not only a state of a case. It is a state of emotion, of exhaustion, of helplessness, of enduring pain with no end in sight. And throughout those years, Trudy was not just a missing girl. She became a symbol of unanswered questions, of cases never resolved. Time continued to pass, but Trudy's case did not. It remained there quietly, as a reminder that some truths are not easily buried, no matter how long it takes. And in the prolonged silence of a cold case, Trudy's family continued to wait, holding on to the fragile hope that one day, the truth would speak. As time passed and Trudy's case reached a dead end, a question began to form in the minds of those who never stopped searching for the truth. If this was not a random accident, then what truly lay behind the disappearance of an 11-year-old child? The answer gradually led investigators into a very different world. A world not meant for children. A world of adults, where poor decisions, addictions, and unnamed debts could produce consequences that could not be undone. Over the years, whispers began to spread through the community. Not loud rumors, but stories told quietly, cautiously. About drugs. About deals conducted in silence. About people no one wanted to approach, yet no one dared confront. Drugs were not merely substances of addiction. In small communities, they formed a network. A closed circle where debts, fear, and violence intertwined. Once someone stepped into that circle, it was nearly impossible to leave without facing consequences. According to what investigators gradually pieced together, Trudy had unknowingly been very close to that darkness. Not because she chose to be there. Not because she understood what was happening, but because the adult world could be cruel enough to pull in those entirely uninvolved. Drug debts were not just numbers. They were pressure, threats, a constant, lurking fear. When a debt could not be repaid with money, it could be replaced by far worse things. And in that world, morality had no place. Investigators began to re-examine the relationships surrounding Trudy's family. Names that had appeared and disappeared. Adults who had been present in her life, even briefly. Every small detail was scrutinized, because when a child goes missing, no detail is insignificant. Late testimonies slowly emerged. Some said they had heard threats. Some said they knew about shadowy transactions taking place at that time. But most said the same thing: they were afraid, and because of that fear, they remained silent. That silence did not come from indifference. It came from very real fear. In a world of drugs and debts, speaking the truth could mean putting oneself and one's family in danger. So many chose to continue living, carrying the weight of what they knew but dared not speak. In all of this, Trudy was the most vulnerable. A child who did not understand how the adult world worked. Who did not know that standing in the wrong place, at the wrong time, could make her the victim of decisions she had no part in. What makes this story so painful is the contrast. On one side, Trudy's world, with its small, simple wishes to swim, to meet a friend, to be home before dinner. On the other side, the adult world, where addictions and debts eroded all boundaries of morality. When these two worlds collided, the one who suffered was not those who had made mistakes. It was a child. And that was an injustice Trudy's family could never accept, no matter how much time passed. For years, investigators faced an invisible wall. Not from lack of effort, but because those who knew the truth had chosen silence. Every time a lead surfaced, it was buried again by fear. And so the darkness deepened. Drugs did not just destroy those who used them. They destroyed those around them. They created a chain reaction with a tragic potential. And in Trudy's case, that tragedy had befallen someone with no ability to protect herself. The darkness behind Trudy's disappearance was not loud. It did not reveal itself immediately. It existed quietly, waiting for time to blur memories, for fear to outweigh courage. And throughout that time, the truth was imprisoned, just as Trudy herself had once been, in her final moments. For Trudy's family, knowing that their child might have become a victim of the adult world was another form of pain. A pain that came not only from loss but from outrage. Outrage that a child had to pay the price for mistakes she did not commit. And from that darkness, Trudy's story moved into a new chapter. A chapter in which the truth would no longer remain hidden forever. But to reach it required many years, many silences, and many people living with fear before they dared to speak. For many years after Trudy disappeared, the case was not only shrouded in a lack of evidence, but also by something far heavier: silence. Not the silence of a file, but the silence of people. There were those who had seen something, those who had heard words that made them uneasy, those who sensed that the afternoon had not been entirely ordinary, as it appeared. Yet all of them made the same choice to remain silent. Not because they didn't care about Trudy, not because they were indifferent, but because of fear. A very real, very specific fear that existed in small communities where everyone knew each other, and where the consequences of speaking out could reach far beyond the person who spoke. In a world where drugs, debt, and quiet violence existed, the truth was not always safe to share. For many, saying what they knew meant putting themselves and their families in danger. And so, they chose silence, even if it meant carrying a burden for a lifetime. Some witnesses had seen a child step into a car. Some had overheard frightening boasts in private conversations. Some knew that Trudy had not disappeared by chance. But all these pieces were held back, buried deep in memory, locked away by fear. Time passed, and silence became a habit. Each year that went by without speaking made it harder to speak. The initial fear slowly transformed into guilt. Guilt for not speaking sooner, and then that guilt became yet another reason to remain silent. Many witnesses lived double lives. One life outwardly, where they continued their routines, went to work, raised children, built families. And an inner life, where memories of Trudy lingered quietly and heavily. Every time the case was mentioned, every time there was new information, those memories resurfaced, reminding them that they knew more than they had said. Some believed that time would make everything pass, that if silence lasted long enough, memories would fade, and the burden in their hearts would feel lighter. But time did not erase it. It only made the silence longer, and the torment deeper. When investigators returned to the case years later, they faced not just an old file. They faced people who had lived decades in fear and guilt. People who were now older, more weary, and beginning to realize that if they didn't speak, the truth might be buried forever. Finally, some witnesses spoke, not because they were no longer afraid, but because that fear had been overcome by something else: regret. Regret for a child who had gone missing, and for not doing everything possible to help uncover the truth. Some said they had remained silent to protect themselves. Some said they feared retaliation. Some said they thought they didn't matter, that what they knew was not enough to change anything. But when pieced together, these testimonies formed a clearer, more painful picture of what had happened. For Trudy's family, knowing that there were people who had remained silent for decades was another blow. Not only because of the pain, but because of the sense that the truth had been so close, yet kept hidden for so long. Each year of silence was a year in which hope had been stretched into hopelessness. The silence of witnesses was not a minor detail in this story. It was central. It showed how fear can suffocate the truth, and it reminded us that in cases like this, the greatest enemy of justice is not just time, it is the silence of people. And then, when those witnesses finally spoke, not to erase the past, but to confront it, Trudy's story began to enter a new phase. A phase in which the truth, though long delayed, finally began to find its way to the light. 28 years passed, but memories did not fade. They only grew deeper, heavier, and harder to speak of. Yet it was precisely that passage of time, in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, that changed the most important thing. Fear began to weaken, and the truth, at last, began to find its voice. After nearly 3 decades, those who had once remained silent were no longer the same people from 1996. They were older, weary, carrying decades of guilt and regret. For many, keeping secrets was no longer protection, it had become a burden far too heavy to bear. When investigators returned to the case, they were not simply reopening an old file. They were unlocking memories that had been sealed for decades, Conversations began to unfold in a very different atmosphere. No more caution, no more evasive answers. Instead came long pauses, trembling words, slow, hesitant, but truer than ever before. Some witnesses said they had waited for this moment for years. A moment when they finally had the courage to speak. Not because they were no longer afraid, but because their fear had finally been outweighed by a guilt that had lasted far too long. Each new testimony was not merely an investigative clue. It was a belated confession, an acknowledgement that their silence had prolonged the suffering of a family, and that the truth, no matter how delayed, needed to be spoken. Details began to fall into place. What had once been dismissed as rumor could now be cross-checked with specific recollections. Gaps in the case file were slowly filled with human memory. Not everything became clear immediately. But for the first time in nearly 30 years, the case was no longer frozen in time. For Trudy's family, these days carried emotions that were hard to name. Hope. Fear. Hope that the truth would finally be recognized. Fear that each newly revealed detail could bring more pain. Hearing the story of their child again, this time through the voices of those who had stayed silent, was an experience no one could be fully prepared for. Yet Trudy's family listened. Because after so many years, they understood that the truth, however painful, was still better than decades of silence. The community, too, began to change its perspective. What had once been whispered was now spoken openly. Questions that had been avoided were finally asked directly. Not to assign blame for the past, but to understand how a child could vanish without anyone speaking out in time. 28 years is long enough for many to believe that everything has been buried. But Trudy's case proved otherwise. The truth can be hidden. It can be delayed, but it does not disappear. It simply waits for someone brave enough to speak. The new testimonies did not immediately bring closure. They did not restore the lost childhood. They did not erase decades of waiting. But they brought something Trudy's family had lacked for nearly 30 years, the acknowledgement that what they had felt all along was real. The truth began to speak not with a loud declaration, but through small words. Words spoken after many hesitations. Yet it was precisely these words that changed the course of the entire investigation. From that moment on, Trudy's story was no longer just a forgotten cold case. It became a powerful reminder that time may fade many things, but it cannot entirely extinguish the truth. And sometimes, justice does not arrive swiftly, it arrives through the persistence of those who refuse to remain silent forever. When the truth began to come together, justice finally knocked. But that door did not open with the decisiveness many had hoped for. It opened slowly, heavily, carrying with it a mix of hope and unease. For between human desire and the framework of the law, there is always a gap that emotions alone cannot bridge. After nearly 30 years, Trudy's case finally entered the stage her family had waited for all their lives: prosecution. A short word, yet behind it lay thousands of pages of case files, decades of investigation, and countless painful memories revisited. For Trudy's family, this was not a victory. It was a moment difficult to name. They did not celebrate. Nor did they feel entirely relieved. No indictment could return their child to them. No trial could make up for decades of waiting in despair. The prosecutors approached the case with a heavy responsibility. Not only to prove what had happened, but to do so within the strict confines of the law. Every charge had to be carefully considered. Every detail had to be substantiated. There was no room for speculation, no room for emotions to lead the way. And it was here that the limits of the legal system became clear. Time had passed too long. Some crimes could no longer be prosecuted. Some acts, though understood by everyone to be wrong, no longer fell within the scope the law allowed. To the public, this might seem unfair. But under the law, these were boundaries that could not be crossed. Trudy's family had to face a painful reality that even as the truth slowly emerged, justice does not always arrive in its entirety. Some questions would never be raised in court. Some crimes would never be officially named. In the courtroom, everything unfolded with cold precision. There was no room for tears, no place for bursts of anger. Only the law and how it was applied. For those who had lived with pain for decades, that coldness was sometimes harder to endure than the silence that had come before. Lawyers spoke of rights, of procedure, of the principle that everyone is presumed innocent until proven guilty. Those words are the foundation of justice. But to Trudy's family, each time they heard them, it stirred the feeling that their child was being weighed in an unfair comparison. Yet prosecution still carried immense significance. It was an official acknowledgement that what had happened to Trudy was a crime, that her disappearance could no longer be treated as an anonymous mystery, that after nearly 30 years, the state and society had finally named what had been hidden for far too long. Legal limits did not erase the pain, but they made one thing very clear: justice is not a perfect concept. It is the product of rules designed to protect society, and sometimes, those very rules make justice feel incomplete for those who have suffered the most. For Trudy's family, the trial was not an endpoint. It was merely another stage in a long journey. They had never chosen one that began on that summer afternoon and stretched across decades of silence. As the case moved into prosecution, the question was no longer only about who had done it. It became about how society would confront this truth. Could we accept that sometimes justice arrives late and incomplete? And did we have the courage to face the limits of the system in which we place our trust? Prosecution was a step forward, but it was also a reminder that some wounds cannot be healed with a verdict alone. And in Trudy's story, justice was not the final destination, it was a part of the long journey, where the truth, at last, could be acknowledged, however belatedly. Nearly 30 years had passed since that summer afternoon. Time had been long enough for everything to change. People grew older, the city transformed. The children of that time had grown up. Yet one thing had remained unchanged all those years: Trudy had not been found. There was no grave for her family to visit, no specific place to lay flowers and say goodbye, only memories, and a question that had never been fully answered. Where was she? Justice may have begun to speak, the truth may have been named in a courtroom, but for Trudy's family, the journey was far from over. For when a child disappears without a trace, the waiting never truly ends. Some cases conclude with a verdict. Others end with the silence that lingers. Trudy belonged to the latter, a story without a clear ending. Only the prolonged absence and the pain that finds no closure. Trudy's family had lived nearly a lifetime in a state of waiting. Waiting for a call, waiting for a clue, waiting for a day when they could bring their child home, even if only to close a journey that had stretched on far too long. The community carried the story too, as a reminder that some events occur yet are never fully resolved. That behind every case file is a human being. Behind every investigation is a family that can never return to the way things were. Trudy was not just a name in the past. She was a reminder of responsibility, of silence, of the tiny moments that could alter an entire life. And until Trudy is found, this story remains unfinished. It stays with us, in memory, in the unanswered question, and in the silence where a child still waits to come home. There are stories that are not told to frighten us. They are told to remind us. To remind us that behind every case there is not a number, not a headline, but a human being. And behind that person is a family that has spent nearly a lifetime waiting. Trudy Appleby's story is not only the story of a missing child. It is a story about the fragility of safety. About how a very small moment, a very ordinary decision, can change a person's fate forever. We often believe that terrible things only happen somewhere far away, somewhere else, to someone else. But Trudy disappeared right outside her own home, in broad daylight, in a community that once believed children were always safe. And that reminds us that danger does not always come with warning signs. This story is also a warning about silence, the silence of those who saw something, who heard something, who knew something, but did not dare to speak, because of fear, because of pressure, because of the belief that one person alone could not change anything. Yet it was that silence that prolonged a family's pain for decades. Not everyone who stays silent is a bad person. Sometimes, they are simply ordinary people placed in situations beyond their ability to face. But Trudy's story shows us one very clear truth: when silence prevails, the truth is buried. And the ones who pay the highest price are often the most vulnerable. This is also a reminder for all of us about community responsibility, about paying attention, listening, and not turning away when something feels wrong. Sometimes, a phone call, a report, an action that seems very small can make a far greater difference than we realize. If you are a parent, this story may make you feel uneasy. But it also reminds us how much care, conversation, and adult presence matter in a child's life. Not to spread fear, but to build safety through awareness and connection. If you are part of a community, this story reminds us that safety is not guaranteed. It must be protected through attentiveness, by not ignoring unusual signs, and by having the courage to speak up, even when it is difficult. And if you are simply someone who is listening, remember that watching until this moment already carries meaning. Because every view, every comment, every share helps keep stories like this from being forgotten. Not to reopen wounds, but to remind us that there are people still waiting to be found. Still waiting to be remembered. Trudy has not been found, but her story remains, as a reminder that we cannot allow ourselves to be indifferent. That the safety of a community is built from the care of each individual. And that sometimes, what matters most is not how many true crime stories we know, but what we learn from them. Remember that. When you leave this video, when you return to your everyday life, when you notice something that feels wrong, because your awareness, your courage, and your willingness to speak may be what prevents another story from becoming the next tragedy. If you've stayed with us until these final moments, it means Trudy Appleby's story has touched you. Not because it's sensational, but because it is profoundly human. A child disappeared, and a family never stopped waiting. Share your thoughts below. Every perspective, every question, every reflection can help keep this story from being forgotten. And sometimes, it's the community speaking up that allows the truth to move forward. If you believe that stories like this deserve to be told with care and honesty, hit subscribe. Here, we don't just recount cases, we preserve the memories of those who cannot speak for themselves.